We think reading great Christian books is vital for spiritual growth. So we are asking significant Christian leaders which 3 books have changed their lives. Philip Yancey is a journalist, best-selling writer and speaker who is loved throughout the world for his honest, insightful and inspirational writing. Over the past 3 decades, he has written more than 20 books, including What's So Amazing About Grace, The Jesus I Never Knew, Prayer, Does It Make a Difference, and most recently, Vanishing Grace.
My book, Vanishing Grace, has a subtitle that says, Whatever Happened to the Good News? And that, frankly, is why I wrote this book. I have an idea what it's like in the UK, but in America, polls are very clear that Christians are no longer perceived as bearers of good news. They're kind of bad news people. They make you feel bad, they're divisive, they're politically fractious, and somehow we're missing the freshness, the good newsness of the gospel. So what I have tried to do in that book is identify people who show us how to represent the good news in an increasingly secular, sometimes even hostile culture and environment. I identify those people, I tell stories, and it's not a bad news book. It's an optimistic book about how we present the good news as good news, even in a culture that is kind of arrayed against it. Well, here in England, you have so many classics to draw from. Even people like Charles Dickens and Anthony Trollope and Jane Austen, they write novels that are really Christian novels out of a Christian sensibility. One that I keep going back to is a book of poems by George Herbert. In fact, I read one every day. And there have been times when my own prayer life has seemed dry. And I'll just turn to that book and say, okay, God, make this my prayer. They're honest, they're reflective, and they're beautifully crafted, and I can't do any better than George Herbert. Well, we Americans depend on the British people to feed us theologically and spiritually, and of course people like C.S. Lewis, G.K. Chesterton, these have fed my soul, and more recently people like John Stott, N.T. Wright. A more recent one that I found is a man called John O'Donohue. He was Irish, a priest, Celtic priest, and died tragically before he was 50 years old. But John O'Donohue wrote a book called Eternal Echoes. And I love the way that it explores philosophy and psychology and nature, and it just has that Celtic wisdom that I had never encountered before. It was one of the most nourishing books I read last year. Well, there are a few American writers that I would recommend to the British reading public. Eugene Peterson. I imagine those of you here in Great Britain would know him mainly because of his paraphrase of the Bible called The Message. But he also wrote, oh my goodness, probably 20 books, and they're all worthwhile. In fact, Bono of U2 was one of Eugene Peterson's fans, and floating around on the internet, if you look far enough, you can find a lovely film clip of Bono visiting Eugene Peterson at his home in Montana. Reading was the way I discovered who I am, in a sense. There's a phrase from the play Shadowlands about C.S. Lewis, and he says, we read to know that we're not alone. And reading became for me a window. I grew up in an unhealthy church. I don't like being preached at. I don't like somebody telling me, this is what you should believe. But when I read, I'm in control. I can decide each page, do I buy this or not? And I value reading so much. There are 2 times a day where I give it priority. First is in the morning. That first cup of coffee, I sit there with kind of the harder stuff, the stuff that nourishes my soul, that challenges me. And then later in the evening, hopefully by a fire, I'll be sitting there and I'll choose something, maybe a novel, a magazine article, or often a long book that I just read a little bit every night. These are my ways to contact the world outside. I know it's hard, especially for young mothers and parents and all that, but again and again, reading transports me from my own little world where I tend to see things this way. It makes me see things from another angle. It's like time travel, where I can step out of myself and be nourished by other people's point of view.
I've got 3 biographies to recommend to you, all really different. The first comes with the approval of my teenage kids. It's called Unpopular Culture, and it's written by the double Mobo award-winning rapper Governor B. It tells the story of how he grew up, how he came to faith, and then how he lived and lives with great success, and yet he's still trying to live faithfully for Christ. Well worth reading, a really short little book. The second is called Fleeing ISIS, Finding Jesus by Charles Morris and Craig Boulez, and it will get you behind some of the headlines of what's going on in the Syria crisis. Some really exciting stories and might help you pray for what's going on in a really tough part of our world. The third book is a bit of a more of a meaty one. It's Martin Luther, Catholic Dissident by Peter Stamford, who's an award-winning journalist, broadcaster, often on the BBC, Channel 4. He writes for The Observer and The Independent. And what fascinated me was that Peter Stamford is a Catholic, and yet he writes a really appreciative biography of Martin Luther, and he doesn't shy away from some of those really tough questions about Luther's beliefs and practices. I love this book and recommend it to you wholeheartedly. Thanks for joining us on Books for Life. We're always keen to help you find your next best read.